for PR research. Sarah, please go ahead.
I am so excited today to be talking about a topic that is extremely near and dear to my heart. Oops, without slides so far, but give me a moment and I'll get it fixed up. There we go. All right, so today I'm going to be talking a bit about the connection between programming languages and human-computer interaction. I work in general on projects that require expertise from both of these. Some of the work that my lab does really only requires PL. Some of the work that my lab does really only requires HCI, but the vast, vast majority really does require combining the two, right? And so I think a lot about this general idea of how do we build that strong bridge between them. And so it's a little bit weird because if we take a look at, well, okay, first let me give you a little bit of a taste of what it looks like to do work at the PL-HCI border. So here is just a quick demo of a project from my amazing student, Parker Ziegler. And what you'll see here is that we're basically doing an interaction where the user is interacting with a GUI, and then off to the right, they've got their JavaScript program that is being built up as they do these interactions with the GUI. Each interaction with the GUI is basically an edit to the program. And this is basically just to demonstrate that some of the stuff that we end up doing is about exploring these sort of somewhat unusual ways of actually interacting with our programming tools, with our programming languages than we are normally used to. And so that's the general space of things that we're thinking about. And so this is going to be a little bit weird because normally I'm over here and I'm spending really most of my time thinking about programming languages. But today I'm going to put on the HCI hat. I'm going to ignore all the sort of PL stuff and talk to you mostly about the HCI because I figure that's the part that y'all haven't heard about before. And that's a little bit weird about what my work looks like relative to the rest of what's happening at PLDI. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start by actually talking about, I think, the #1 thing that folks associate with HCI, which is user studies. So I think probably a lot of folks are aware of the fact that some programming languages papers do include studies of people, often but not always of programmers. And with many apologies for making you do interactive stuff at this time of the afternoon, I am now going to make you do interactive stuff at this time of the afternoon. I want you to turn to someone next to you and chat about why. Why are we studying users? So come up with an answer and I'll ask folks to shout out. All right, what do we think? Why might we be studying people? Anyone want to shout it out? People use programming languages, absolutely, right? There's another thing in this system other than the programming language. There's also the person who is writing programs with that programming language. I love it. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Sorry to make you run around with the mic.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. So programming language is ultimately a tool to build other tools that are also used by non-programmers as well. So.
I love it. Yeah, there's another answer back behind you.
To see if you're delusional or is it actually needed?
This is my favorite answer, to see if you're delusional. Absolutely, right? Like, we made this programming language thing. Is it working? Like, we had some idea, we thought it was gonna be good. I think that is the first thing that most of us think about, is like, okay, this is part of the evaluation, right? We have built this programming language thing, did it work? But what I want to mostly spend our time today talking about, and with apologies for cutting off the folks who had other answers, is the other ways that we can also use user studies, right? There are all kinds of things that we can actually do with them. And I'm going to introduce us to 3 buckets that are probably the most useful buckets for those of us in the programming languages community. We're going to start over here with need finding, right? We're coming into a space. People are doing something where we think a programming language or another programming tool could help them. What's going on in that space? What's going well? What's going badly? What are they struggling with? What might we be able to help them with, right? Let's learn about what are the problems. The next category that I'm going to introduce us to is the idea of a formative study, right? So once we've actually selected a problem, right? We saw sort of the space of problems out there. We decided this is the one I'm interested in tackling. We've got to actually design something that we think is going to help, something that's going to be a solution. What is information that we could learn about the user that would help us make a promising solution? And then we can head over to evaluative studies, which is the am I delusional one, right? The is this thing that I built for a fixed problem, this fixed solution, is this actually doing the thing that I thought it was going to do? And so all of these turn out to be really, really useful in the process of doing a programming languages design project, whether you're building a programming language, a programming tool, a programming environment, whatever it is that you might be doing. I'm also going to briefly mention, I introduced that first category as need finding, but in fact, I think it's actually better to think of that more as reconnaissance, right? Because we do want to know, okay, what are the things that are going badly in this space, but we also kind of have to know what are the things that are going well, because we don't want to come in with some intervention that we have in mind, right, our new abstraction, our new whatever, and have that fix this problem that we identified while actually messing up 5 things that were previously working well, right? So we do want to actually know both what is going well and what is going badly. So, okay. Our next part of interactive session, right? What is the first thing we should do if we start thinking about actually running one of these things? What is the first thing we should do as we are designing our user study? So again, turn to someone nearby. What is task number 1 for us? Go ahead and chat for a moment, then we'll chat. Identify users, I like it. Chat with someone nearby, and we'll come together and we'll throw out our ideas. All right, so I've put this on this memorable background because this is the thing that I find that students forget most frequently when they start trying to run user studies in this area. So we definitely want to remember this step. Anyone want to throw out an idea?
We can start by collecting use cases.
We can start by collecting use cases. I like it. What else we got? Fix a specific domain, absolutely, right? We don't want to just go out and be, looking at the whole wide world of programming. We're probably not going to see enough patterns in common for it to be useful. What else we got?
Select tasks which define a control group and the experiment group.
Select tasks. Okay, so we're thinking about the idea of a controlled experiment where we would have a control condition and an intervention condition. That makes sense for an experiment.
Figure out who we want to be part of the user study in the first place.
Figure out who we want to be involved in the first place. Who are the users that we care about? Absolutely.
So first define the hypothesis that you want for the user study and get approval from your
I love both of those answers. I think that's close enough that we move on to my particular answer, which is choose your research question, right? Choose your research question. What is it that you're actually using this user study to do, right? We're not just throwing a user study into it for the sake of it. Right? It's hard to run a user study. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of energy. You have to do a lot of emailing, right? Go ahead and make sure you're actually going to do something with the information that you get out, right? So again, basically thinking about okay, why is that the first step? It comes down to we're not doing this just for the sake of doing this, right? We want to learn things that are going to help us design and implement useful and usable languages and tools and interventions, right? So how can we figure out if our study design is going to help us get the answer to our key design questions if we don't yet know what our design questions are? And so I'm now going to have us spend a little bit of time thinking about what the research questions look like for those 3 categories of user studies that we just talked about a couple slides back. So this, I think, is probably sort of the most open-ended and, in some ways kind of limited template. So this is thinking about what is going to be the shape of a need-finding or reconnaissance user study question. And as I mentioned before, we are also looking to learn about what's going well, not just looking to figure out challenges. But in general, this shape of research question is often what you will see, right? You will see what kinds of challenges is a particular category of users facing in a particular category of tasks. And that definitely connects back to some of the answers that we heard, right? You have to pick who you care about. You have to pick the kinds of tasks you care about, right? For formative research, it can be a lot more open-ended. I didn't even bother trying to write just one template for what we might learn in a formative study, right? This is going to be super free form because we're really thinking about our own design process, our own plans for potential solutions we might want to explore, and only we are going to know what is the thing that could help me do the next stage of my design process or my implementation process. And it's going to vary basically depending on the kinds of tasks that I am trying to support, the kinds of tool I'm trying to build. The information about users that is going to help me do that is going to vary so much based on the context, right? One that's pretty common for PL folks is I have these 3 ideas for interventions. If I sort of mock up what the experience of interacting with these 3 tools or these 3 languages would be like, which of those works for users? Or you might be thinking about like, okay, I have some abstraction ideas in mind, but what is the information that's going to be really natural and easy for users to give me versus what kind of information is actually super hard for them to give me? I don't want my abstractions to be demanding information that's hard for them, or likewise my programming tools. And then if we take a look at the evaluative RQ, I think that's the one that we tend to think about, right? And that's probably the one where we're thinking about, say, controlled studies, controlled experiments. We're thinking about, okay, I want to go ahead and decide we're going to have this kind of tool, right, the tool I've built. We're going to figure out if it increases or decreases some measure of success. We know the audience, we know the kind of tasks. But actually, choosing specific tasks is really hard. And honestly, turning this idea of a measure of success into a number is also super hard, right? If we are trying to measure time to correctness, well, what is correct? Who's deciding when we're done with building this program? Are we leaving it to the participant? Are we the researcher stepping in and doing it? Are we doing it by providing them with some kind of automated check? Are we actually doing a hidden automated check? Are we going in and deciding subjectively when they're done, right? Like all of this stuff about actually turning a measure into a number is actually pretty hard. But this is the general shape of the research questions for these 3 categories. And so now we get back into our interactive time. I'm going to have you turn to someone next to you. And basically what we're reflecting on is we can use the research question to figure out what kind of study we are dealing with. So turn to the person next to you. Which category is this paper's study? They have a couple of studies, actually. But for the study that was answering this research question, what kind of user study were they running? And I've reminded us of our 3 categories on the right here. Discuss for 20 seconds. All right, I am now going to ask you to hum in order to vote. So please hum if you think this is a reconnaissance study. Hum if you think this is a formative study. Hum if you think this is an evaluative study. Yeah, I agree. This one seems like an evaluative study. What about this one? Turn to the folks next to you. Hum if you think reconnaissance study. Hum if you think formative. Hum if you think evaluative. Yeah, I agree, right? This one seems like a reconnaissance study. We're coming in, we're figuring out what's happening in that space. What about this one? This time I'm giving you 10 seconds. I think you're getting the hang of this. All right, hum if you think reconnaissance. Hum if you think formative. Hum if you think evaluative. All right, yeah, I think those two categories seem like the likeliest. Yeah, I think they were basically using this as a formative, but this is a good reminder of the fact that, it kind of depends on the context of the study, right? Are we trying to go in and say, here's our particular solution, how's it compared to these other two? Or are we trying to use this in order to shape how we continue evolving the tool, right? So some of this isn't really about the underlying structure of the data that we're using or the particular process that we're following. It's just about that context. So I'm actually, since we're starting to run a little low on time, going to skip us through a few of these, but I highly recommend taking a look at these kinds of questions. And this brings us to our question here, right? So we had the last one, we had a couple of different answers. And so does it really matter if we can cleanly categorize these? No, it doesn't really matter super much. The big thing I want y'all to take away from this is just the fact that we can use user studies for these different kinds of questions that we might have, much more than, okay, is it easy to slot it into the correct box, right? It's more knowing that we can use studies over the course of multiple parts of our process. So all of these studies can be really useful, but I think the one that's usually the most surprising to programming languages folks is that first category. And so I'm going to have to spend a little more time here. Let's dive in. What does it look like to actually do that? And the first thing I want us to think about is this, right? So don't try to use a study instead of doing design. That is just not going to work, right? And so when we're doing need finding, a need is sort of approximately a problem, a challenge. A need is not going to be a solution. And so one of the things that I see people doing over and over is doing their analysis on the data from a need finding study and saying, because it says need finding right there in the name, they say people need X, right? But then X is a solution rather than, a challenge, right? And so the thing that I want us to think about here is that when we are doing need finding, we're doing what the name says. We are finding needs. We're not finding solutions. We'll brainstorm solutions later. And good need finding typically also doesn't actually involve asking people what they want, which I will also dive into a few slides from now. But if you've heard the sort of quote that is tending to be ascribed to Henry Ford, but apparently was not actually a quote he made, it was, if I had asked people what they would have wanted, they would have said faster horses rather than saying cars, right? Is sort of the implicit idea there. But that's really not what we're doing in need finding. We're not just asking people what they want and then going off and doing that. We really are just trying to uncover what's going well, what's going badly. Is there a space for us to intervene? Okay, a very simplified timeline. Basically, this is just saying that if you are going to try to actually do all these kinds of user studies, well, you are going to have a very separate process between when you are doing your reconnaissance study versus when you are doing your brainstorming, right? The brainstorming is the part where you start coming up with ideas for solutions. That is going to be separate from actually doing your reconnaissance study. Okay, and now back to the idea of we're not just asking users what they want. So we want to structure our need finding study so that users show, don't tell. If you've ever heard the writing advice, show, don't tell, right? Usually for creative writing. We are doing that exact same thing. So for some reason, this does seem to be counterintuitive to people. Everyone seems to expect that a user study is going to involve interviewing folks. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with also talking to participants, but you will learn way more about their programming process by watching them actually program for 5 minutes than you will by chatting with them for 5 minutes about their programming process. So let's talk about why. The big reasons are these three. I'm going to dive into each of them individually. So one, we could fail to learn true things. 2, we could learn false things. And 3, we could learn true things, but poorly. So why observation, right? You are someone who is attending PLMW. You know a lot about what languages, libraries, programming environments, synthesizers, and other tools can do for users relative to the average human. Your participants might know this, right? Maybe they are also PL experts, or they might not, right? The result then is that problems that they see as irrelevant may seem very relevant to you, right? They would never think to mention it. Right? One of the most common things in the need finding studies that my own lab has run is that someone will get into a space and they'll be like, oh my God, you just spent 10 hours doing XYZ thing? And they're like, oh yeah, it's really embarrassing. Honestly, I should have been doing that all weekend so I'd be ready already. And this is something that we know that a tool could come in and help. And they didn't even think to mention it because to them it's just so natural that this is just a process that they need to do, right? So they're not going to always be able to point to the things that are going to be relevant information to you, which is why we come in and watch. Another good reason, it is actually pretty easy to learn false things if we just try to ask folks. So at this point, this is a pretty well-established idea from the psych literature. It turns out that the questions we ask shape responses, often unintentionally. we don't have, as humans, a durable, reliable memory of facts. We also turn out not to have a durable, reliable database of our own preferences. So you may think, oh, well, okay, if I'm not asking them about facts, that at least when I'm asking sort of what they prefer, that's something that it's safe to just ask them about. Even that can be sketchy. So let's quickly talk through a couple of these psych studies that have studied this. So this is a study where they showed folks a video of a car crash. There was no shattered glass in that car crash. And then they asked folks, I believe it was a week later, did you see shattered glass in this video? And if you ask folks, did they see it when these cars crashed into each other, the rate, or sorry, no, it was, yeah, when these cars hit each other, the rate was pretty close to when they didn't use any particular words to describe what happened to the two cars. Versus if you ask, did you see any glass when the cars smashed into each other, all of a sudden the rate of people saying, oh yeah, I saw shattered glass goes up. Right? So we can really, without intending to, just end up really strongly shaping the answers that we're getting from folks, even about facts. Right? We also don't have durable, consistent preferences marked down in a mental table that we just look up for, when we are thinking about our own priorities. Right? So again, this is something that we're starting to figure out. The way that we are asking those questions actually changes the preferences that folks report back to us. And also, finally, we just get a lot more detail from seeing something happen than from hearing it retold, right? Think about how much more you know about an event that you have lived relative to a similar event that a friend relayed, even if they told you the story. If you turn to the person next to you and you have them describe the program that they are working on right now, and then you go actually look at that program, there's still going to be stuff that they didn't describe that you were surprised by. One quick thing, we don't actually get to make any extra claims about things being natural just because we are observing them instead of hearing them or reading them, doing an interview about them, right? Both what people say and what we observe when we are watching them work, those are still shaped by their context, the constraints that they're currently working under, the history of languages and tools they've used before, their education, the things their friends and colleagues have told them. Observing doesn't get us out of this one, right? We would have this problem if we just interviewed. We still have this problem, unfortunately, when we are doing observations. We're just getting a more detailed picture of how they're doing things under the current system, not a sort of contextless snapshot of how they would do things without the constraints imposed by their environment and their path up until this point. Okay, to do PLHCI work, do I have to run user studies, right? This talk is focused a lot on user studies. Does that mean we gotta do it if we're trying to do stuff that matches together PL and HCI? Definitely not, right? I have focused on it because it's one of the things that we don't encounter that much in a PL space. But it's just one of the many tools in the HCI toolbox. You can definitely do PL/HCI space without doing user studies. In fact, 2 of my students here are presenting 2 examples of exactly that, some PL/HCI work that does not actually include user studies at the main conference. It's totally normal. It just changes what you can claim, just as you can't make performance claims without including performance data, right? Although the data does not have to be a user study. And this is probably not surprising to you, right? The fact that you can't make usability claims just because you find it usable and your co-author finds it usable, right? We're not doing the 1770 thoughts I had in the bath argument anymore. It's the tweet on the right is no longer how we're doing it. We do have to give evidence if we want to make claims, but it's okay to not make claims about user experience. And in fact, I teach a whole class about topics in this general area, and there's a whole session devoted to situations in which you probably should not run a user study, right? There are lots of other ways to argue for importance. All right, we're going to wrap up. One last message as we wrap up. You don't have to do a full-on user study in order to get the benefits of observation, right? Even if you never want to publish a user study, you don't care about doing a full-scale thing of it. If you care about making tools that are useful and usable by real people, go ahead and put your tools in front of real users. Do it early and often. So even if you don't ever make any user experience claims in your papers, if you do care about it, at least do this casual, unofficial way of observing users. I promise you will learn so much by just sitting down and watching a rando use your tool for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever length of time you can give to it, you are going to learn a lot. And it's going to be very tempting for you to intervene, for you to teach them how to use the tool right. Don't do that, right? Don't watch yourself use the tool by sending them instructions for what to do with their hands. Instead, just go ahead and watch them use the tool and see what happens. All right, I will wrap it up by reminding you of the 3 categories of user studies that we have chatted about today, and reminding us how they can help us do stronger programming languages research. In particular, if we're doing reconnaissance studies, we can go ahead and use HCI techniques to try to pick higher impact problems. If we are doing formative studies, we can use it to refine more promising solutions. And if we are doing evaluative studies, we can go ahead and use our HCI techniques to understand whether we are delusional, whether the languages, the environments, the other programming tools that we have designed are in fact having the impact that we want. I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for the great talk. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you for the amazing talk. So this is something like I encountered when I was doing my research, is you could formulate your problem in a way where if you say it one way, there's a lot of human interaction. If you say it another way, like you can forget about human interaction altogether.
Absolutely.
Like I was working on a debugging project. You could talk about debugging as a user-facing thing where like how can you make sure that the user learns from the debugger and fixes the problems? Or you can ignore that altogether and talk about how accurate the debugger is. Then you just have to compare it to ground truth. So how do you decide like what is more useful and what you should do?
I love this question. Honestly, as with so much of what we're doing when we decide how to evaluate our tools, I think this is a question about evaluation. As of so much of how we're deciding what to evaluate, it comes down to your own preferences, what matters to you, what your values are, and how those connect to your research, right? If you think about the intro section that you eventually want to write, the motivation for why we should care about this problem, you can think of your intro as basically making promises that the evaluation has to then hold up, right? So if you're going to try to promise that this is something that really helps real users to debug, okay, you probably want to do a user study. If you just want to say, hey, we believe that it could be useful to have a debugger that has better accuracy, better whatever, go ahead and have that be the contents of the eval section. It really just comes down to the arguments you want to make, the claims you want to make. It's super individual.
Thank you for the great talk. So when you run a user study, and you probably have some kind of idea of how the results are going to be, do you have some kind of bias before you run a user study? And what if the user study comes out horribly opposite of what you've actually expected? And what do you do to cope with those results?
Also an amazing question. I actually think the most interesting user studies are almost always the ones where you don't really know in advance what's going to happen, right? If you think of something like the need finding study, right? The reason you're bothering to do that study is because you are legitimately trying to learn something, right? You don't know what is going to happen before you go into it, right? If you already knew, you wouldn't need to run this study. But I think, again, we're probably talking more about evaluative studies here. And so what if we get a surprise there? I think that's a huge part of why it's worthwhile to do formative studies, whether formally or informally, right? If we are at every stage of the process putting our tool in front of users, we're not going to get that surprise at the point that we reach the evaluation stage, right? So if we have sort of done this user-centered process over the course of the entire project arc, then I don't think that we have to really be anticipating surprises at that evaluation stage. Right? It's just a matter of integrating knowledge about users at every part of the process.
So that's why formative study is kind of important before going straight into evaluative study.
A metaphor that I really like is sort of the Google Maps or whatever Maps app that you like, right? We could just walk out into the city and then check, am I at the coffee shop I was trying to reach?
Oh, yeah.
Or we could like look at it before we set out and pick a particular coffee shop. We could be looking at it when we hit a confusing turning, right? Like, think about going to users in the same way. We just want to open the map and check how we're doing.
Thanks for the great answer.
Thank you so much for presenting HCI stuff at a PL thing. I think this is great. My question is kind of around, if we're running user studies, there aren't like that many people realistically in the world who can program, and the sorts of experiences that people have who can, they're like formed by the universities that they went to and like how long they've been programming and the sorts of programming that they've done. How do we like control for these things or like leverage these sorts of things when we're doing user studies to make sure that the results that we're collecting are like actually good and useful?
I love this. So there's a couple of different answers to this. I'll give sort of the simple answer to this question first, and then we can dive into sort of the nuances. So one of the most sort of representative studies of a tool that I've ever seen was in a programming context. And it was because there were about 10 people in the world who used a particular tool, and they had made a debugger for that tool, and they basically had a user study that had all 10 people who used that tool, right? Like, incredibly representative sample. In some ways, just the ideal sample. But yeah, you're absolutely right that, if we are, really trying to recruit, and recruiting is one of the hard parts of doing these, and we're expecting to get, I talked about the idea that just because we're observing users doesn't mean that what we're seeing is natural. It is going to be informed by their education. Usually what this means is that we want to collect a lot of information about the users who we are having as our participants and say, okay, we're observing that, education did affect this outcome, but not this outcome. We're observing that, we're seeing an effect of years programming with XYZ language on how quickly they do XYZ, but not with this other thing, right? So we want to look out for cases where the variations that we're seeing in our population are actually affecting the outcomes that we care about. And we want to be sort of clear and upfront about the participants that we are bringing in, right? We shouldn't disguise that it's all, undergrads at a particular university. Like, try not to have that as your sample in general, but like, if that is the situation you find yourself in, just say it.
Since you just mentioned undergrads, interestingly enough, I heard previously a talk about someone claiming that those are actually best programmers to test these things on because they haven't been ruined yet by industry. What are your thoughts on that?
The even more extreme version of this, if you've ever heard of the idea of natural program elicitation, the idea is to sort of set some kind of programming task in front of folks and then see what naturally they would use to express this. And one of the things that people have realized, of course, is that any amount of training they've had is going to end up changing the answers that you will get to that. And so people are like, what we got to do is bring in children who have never done any programming before, right? Like the 6-year-olds, what would they say? And people actually do that, right? Like there are folks who will actually run the studies that way. Again, it really comes down to what you are trying to do, right? If what you want to do is create a programming language or a programming tool that is going to reach current industry programmers, study industry programmers. If you're trying to change the future of how programming works for everyone and it should change how people are educated from the very beginning, maybe you're doing children who have never seen programming before, right? Like, you just want to think about what are the goals. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Funniest one I've seen so far. So you mentioned that you don't have to do user studies to do PLACI work, and you gave one example that's like you build infrastructure. What other PLACI work would not like involve user studies? Like how do you put the human in without the human? Totally.
Yeah. So I'll just reflect on the examples that my own students are presenting at PLDI this year. Basically, it's thinking about, hey, here is, in one case, here's a programmer interaction model that we already know is good, right? Known good. And we are figuring out how to apply it in a new setting, right? Here's a setting where previously programs were considered to be too long running in order to do XYZ. We have figured out how to make it work in that setting. Another is, hey, in order to offer a brand new programming languages interface, like a new interaction with our programming tools, a new user interaction model, we would have to do all of this PL work to build up that interaction, right, in order to be able to even offer it. And that all on its own is going to require about a whole paper's worth of infrastructure. And so we're not going to be able to actually also mash that in with a user study, figure out if it also works. If we want to go ahead and figure that out later, we're going to have to go off and do a user study and do a separate paper. Yeah. All right.
Okay, let's thank Sarah again for the great talk.